for the YouTube. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're coming back from our break here, and we're going to pick up our work on S17. And we'll begin with testimony from the network. Karen, are you live there? Great. I think you're still muted.
I'm here and I'm muted, but now I'm unmuted.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. And if you could introduce yourself for the record, and I think you had some testimony to offer about the standby services issue.
Thanks so much, Chair McCarthy. I'm so glad to be here. I'm Karen Tronsgaard Scott, and I work at the Vermont Network, where my role is as its executive director. Thank you, committee, for the opportunity to testify today on S17. We want to address a small but critically important issue in Section 6 of S17, sheriffs accompanying survivors to retrieve personal belongings, often referred to as, this is standby. Sheriffs often accompany survivors to their homes so they can safely collect their possessions after a relief from abuse order has been issued. Many sheriffs charge fees for this service, but many do not charge. So that's worth noting. Because the fees are most often not affordable for survivors, our 15-member organizations are frequently put in a position of trying to find the funds to be able to pay the sheriffs for this service. Often they are asking members of the community to cover the cost, or local churches, or they find the money within their own budgets. The fees range from $75 an hour to $150 an hour, and often include a minimum number of hours as well as a charge for mileage. Some sheriff's department, as I said earlier, some sheriff's departments cover this cost and some do not. Combined, the nonprofit organizations in our community and our community members, as well as survivors themselves, are paying thousands of dollars a year to access protection when removing belongings in the wake of violence. I want to make a note that across our state, from DCF to VSP to town police departments, there's a unified commitment to enhance survivor safety at every turn. And I want to really thank the Vermont State Police, as well as our local police departments, for continuing to provide this service at no cost to survivors. It's really clear that they have a deep commitment to survivor safety and community safety. We have a couple concerns about current practice that I'm very happy to share with you. First of all, charging survivors access to safety. So for survivors who need to remove items pursuant to a relief from abuse order, standby assistance from law enforcement agencies it should be provided free of charge to these citizens. It's noteworthy that the state of Vermont has made policy decision to cover the cost of domestic violence offender accountability programs at no cost to those offenders. And we fully support that policy, but it is noteworthy that survivors are simultaneously charged in order to safely remove belongings from their abusive home. Also, we're noting that there's a geographic inequity around this policy. There's wide variation, a lack of consistency in the fees charged, in whether they are charged, and again, some sheriff's departments never charge fees, and some charge as much as $150 an hour, and often with a 3-hour minimum plus mileage. So you can see that these costs are incredibly prohibitive for survivors. So there's really significant geographic injustice across our state based on this approach. So we're asking, we've had some conversations with the Sheriff's Association, and the network is requesting the language in S17 to ensure that the sheriffs provide this assistance without charging a fee to the survivor or any of their representatives. And we agreed with the sheriffs that we can have a conversation over the course of the summer to collect more data and assess the needs, especially in relationship to collecting for defendants to be able to collect their possessions. So I've sent a copy of some requested language to you, and what that does is establish that the sheriff's departments will offer these services, and they will offer them at no cost to survivors. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
And thank you. I'll open it up to the committee, but I'll go first here. I am wondering if you saw in the last couple of drafts, so we now have a draft 3.1 that just came out, that was just posted within the last 30 minutes or so. And it maintains the spirit of that section 60 that came over to us in the S17 Senate as passed, but tries to clarify a little bit that it's not exclusively the duty of sheriffs if there are other law enforcement agencies that, so the language that came over from the Senate could be interpreted, we had heard in testimony, as the sheriffs being the exclusive providers of standby services, which I don't think was the network's intent. But I just wanted to clear that out from your perspective, that something like this that basically says survivors aren't going to be charged. If sheriffs are requested to provide the service, they shall, but they won't be the only law enforcement agency providing standby service.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't seen that latest version, but based on what you're describing, Chair McCarthy, it sounds like it meets the intent of, and will solve the issue that we're concerned about. And as I said earlier, there's a long history of town police officers, as well as the Vermont State Police, of providing this service without charging survivors. And so that's part of the information that we need to collect, is where are these services being provided? How are they being provided? By whom are they being provided? And you know, how does that all configure for survivors?
I'm looking at the suggested language in the written testimony that you provided, and it sounds like the addition that you're suggesting here is a required, report back or collaboration between the network and the Sheriff's Association. It seems like there's already a dialogue about that. Do you feel strongly that we need to add that to the bill, or is that something that the Sheriff's Association and the network could probably do without the statutory language?
Well, we've had some really great conversations with the sheriffs, and the good news about those conversations is that I think that we have a unity of vision. So in our conversation with the Sheriff's Association, we recognize that we all agree that this is the most dangerous point in an abusive relationship, the point at which a relief from abuse order is issued and the survivor is leaving the shared home. So we all know that and agree that it's important for us to get this right. It's actually the suggestion of the Sheriff's Association that we get together over the summer and take a look at this so that we can come back next year and have more information. We need a lot more information. We need data, and then be able to come back next year with an actual long-term plan. So whether or not it is in statutory language, of course, we would love to see it in statutory language, but understand that you may not wish to do that. But again, this was the idea of the Sheriff's Association. So I would be interested to know if they also, what their opinion would be about having the provision in statutory language.
Well, before I ask Sheriff Anderson from the association to come up, does anybody on the committee have any questions for Karen? Representative Hickley.
Thank you, Karen. I guess maybe you said this. How many RFAs are there in a given year, roughly?
Well, in a given year across our state, there are about 2,000 RFAs issued. On a temporary basis. So RFAs go through a two-step process. There's a temporary RFA, and then which lasts for about 2 weeks. And then there's a hearing that's held, and a permanent RFA is issued. And there's about a 50% drop off between the issuance of a temporary RFA and the issuance of a permanent RFA. So about 1,000 RFAs are issued a year. Not all of those RFAs are held by survivors who feel like they need standby. So that's one of the questions that we need to collect data on is, how many people are we talking about here?
Then just a follow up too, I think you said, does it cost your network thousands of dollars a year, or how much does it?
Well, we don't have that information because what I refer to is it costs in those places where there's a fee charged and the network program has the ability to support the survivor, then the network program will support the survivor. But they don't, there's no line item for this. They might talk to a local church and ask them for money, or to a benefactor of the organization and ask them for money. But survivors very often, many survivors never contact the network program. And so they're out there on their own and they're actually paying out of pocket for the service. And so we know that there's, we do know that there's enough people across our state that are paying, upwards of $600 for the service. So we know that there's thousands of dollars that are being spent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Karen? Well, Sheriff Anderson, if you're willing to speak to this particular issue at this point, since you're in the room, it might be useful.
Good morning. For the record, Mark Anderson, President of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. So you've heard me say this before. This is compelling us to do something in a way, but also says let's study it. So to the question of do we need the study, we certainly are willing to work with the network to do that. I don't think we need statute to do that, but really I don't see need in the sense of gathering the data, what the collaboration is, but they'd be a natural partner to collaborate with. The reason I say that is because we'd be the one providing the service. So it would just all be internal to us. The Sheriff's Association, instead of, so there's an interpretation that this does not preclude the state police or municipal police departments, and certainly do not want to suggest that they're not unwilling to do these. But often our experiences in communities that the state police and municipal police departments cover, we're receiving the calls. I've done these in Brattleboro, where they have a full service police department. I've done these in communities where the state police are the sole provider of services. So to that end, the reason why the Sheriff's Association is concerned about the compulsion is because if, as written, it says if we provide law enforcement in the county, well, I have 23 towns, of which 15 contract with me for law enforcement. So Brattleboro does not contract with me for law enforcement. How do I pay my staff? How do I pay for the car to go to Brattleboro, to sit there for 4 to 8 hours while the U-Haul truck's filled up? And that's where we start to run into issues. We received information from the judiciary yesterday that there's over 6,000 relief from abuse orders that were issued in fiscal year 22. If I drop that even by half, because they were not able to track what's required law enforcement presence, but if we cut that in half, that's 3,000 RFAs. If we assume even just 4 hours to load the U-Haul truck, then, I mean, we're talking 27,000 manpower hours or personnel hours. And so this is where we become concerned about how do we pay for this? How do I tell my deputy to volunteer? Obviously I can't. So then it comes into the internal operations of each individual department, the financial resources of each individual department. And I think our consistent message has been, if we're going to be required to do this, please provide us some resources to do it. So I agree with Ms. Tronsgaard Scott that we have a shared vision. Victims shouldn't pay for this. Survivors shouldn't pay for this. There's a variety of circumstances where these are not ideal circumstances. We've never been provided the resources to do this in the first place, which is why victims were asked through the Victims Compensation Fund under the prior administration to pay for it, which is how we ended up in a circumstance where we were getting reimbursed because the victim was getting reimbursed through the Victims Compensation Fund. So that's not an ideal system. We've learned that through this bill. I'm just concerned that this does create language that will cause municipal departments to say, well, it says they can ask the sheriff, so ask the sheriff, because there's complete silence on who's responsible for this otherwise in state statute.
Representative,
I guess, where does this money come from that's in the Victims Compensation Fund?
I would not be a good person to answer that question, but I understand it is not generally considered not sufficient. And I fundamentally agree that what we did was a workaround, but not a good solution. Talking with the executive director of victims compensation very briefly, and talking with John Campbell at DSAS, I think the policy is agreeable that it shouldn't come from victims compensation. That's identified for other reasons. But then where does it come from? So I mean, Mr. Chair, if I may offer a simple tweak, the language in 3.1, if we say delete county and replace it with the primary law enforcement agency, every municipality through its E911 coordinator has to identify their emergency services. That's true in all 250, I guess, 2 towns now, and the incorporated villages. So they designate that to the state of Vermont. There's a clear registry of who's responsible for this, for law enforcement in any jurisdiction in the state of Vermont. It seems to be a realistic thing because they're already resourced to provide this. And while it continues as an unfunded mandate to that point, these are departments that are resourced. If my agency provides services in the town of Putney, which we do, for law enforcement, then we would be the ones providing it through our contract with the town of Putney. But then I'm not required to do it in the town of Brattleboro where I have no resource.
Representative.
Just for clarification, where is that wording included? So it's in section 6, right?
Yeah.
So B, D. Okay, and it would be
So
primary law enforcement agencies, correct? Correct.
what I'm proposing is to delete on line 19, providing law enforcement services for the county, delete county, and replace that with law enforcement services for the town, and I guess introduce something to the effect of saying whoever provides the primary law enforcement coverage for a community as opposed to just the sheriff's department. I think it still accomplishes the network's goal of having law enforcement present. And those are in communities that are already resourcing law enforcement.
Well, does the committee have any other questions for Sheriff Anderson? Thank you. Or Representative Waters Evans, go ahead.
Thank you. So who makes the call asking for the assistance?
So the general process is that when a relief from abuse order is issued, there's going to summarize it as 2 processes that might be a little high level, but process number 1 is an emergency process. There's a 24/7-800 number. Process number 2 is the judiciary, a judge giving opportunity for either the survivor themselves or the survivor and the, I'll call it the defendant, the plaintiff and the defendant, to come before the court. And so those are the temporary and the what will eventually become the final relief from abuse order. The judiciary is the one who would dictate that a defendant, or in some cases it does happen, a plaintiff is required or is allowed to go to a property in the presence of law enforcement to obtain their property. On temporary relief from abuse orders, and this is a very common practice, temporary orders, usually it's 15 minutes, get the toothbrush, get the laptop, get change of clothes, someone staying in a hotel or a friend's house or whatever that may be. On final orders, it's get the bed, get the dresser, get the dog, the cat. It can be several U-Haul loads. It can be several hours. We've had some go multi-day. So we're not talking an insignificant amount. So back to your question. As written in this draft, it would be the survivor who is requesting the service of the department. The I believe I read that correctly, and they would be the triggering event. There's also, I don't think it's a significant issue, but we want to make sure that there's not third-party contact between the plaintiff and the defendant in the order. And so generally law enforcement transacts the arrangement of this. So there's also some logistical work that leads into it.
Thanks.
Representative Hango.
Thank you. I just want to clarify with Ms. Transgard Scott that the victim doesn't actually, the survivor doesn't actually have to pick up the phone to call a law enforcement agency, that your network would help with that and maybe make the call for them? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry about that. If the victim is working with a member organization, then certainly we would help them make that call.
Okay.
But
that's
not all
great.
victims work with our member organizations.
Understood, but if you are involved, you would be able to make the call for that person.
We would
because
help them
that-
make the call. We wouldn't necessarily, we would do whatever they needed us to do.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions from our witnesses on this? I want to have a little bit of a committee discussion about exactly what to do with this section, because I want to try to give Mr. Devlin some direction. So Sheriff Anderson, thank you.
Thank you.
Stick with us. So just kind of zooming out, as this bill came over to us from the Senate, this was basically just a straight up sheriff shall provide this service. They won't charge survivors. The language that's before you in 3.1 was an attempt to say sheriffs will provide this assistance upon request, but to not preclude the primary law enforcement agencies from providing standby service. Representative Hango.
Thank you. I'm just going to throw some language out there that maybe we say the individual who requires assistance would contact the primary law enforcement agency. And that could include the sheriff's department
For that community.
for that community. And community could mean town, county, village, state, yes, because some communities have no law enforcement contracts.
So here's Representative, go ahead. No, I don't want to dominate this conversation. Go ahead.
I guess my question is about the service is being provided now. I understand, like, that's not happening if it's needed.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if we need to require who does it in this bill, or if the issue is really making sure that the survivor doesn't have to pay for it. Because it sounds like we don't want to require an agency to do it if they have no funds to do it. And also we don't want to require the survivor to pay for it. So I'm wondering, where is the exact thing that we need to put in the bill?
That's a great question. That is exactly the trouble here. There seems to be broad agreement from the network, sheriffs, most of us, I think, that we don't want survivors to have to pay for the service in a time where they're fleeing and they've been granted a relief from abuse order, whether it's temporary or final. And there's also the acknowledgement that this can really rack up serious hours. So I think that what we're left with here is that we really need the data. So I'm sort of hearing this conversation inclined to adopt something like the language that Ms. Scott put in there, but to also soften the languages. I'm hearing from a couple of the comments here that there's a desire to sort of say, well, this isn't just the sheriff's providing the service now. We want to make sure there aren't any primary law enforcement agencies in any communities that are charging survivors. So what's good for sheriffs should be good for all of those. But really, we need to come back to this next year and either say the state is going to pay for these hours, or we really think that, municipal, state, and county law enforcement agencies can absorb the cost. Right now, we don't have the data to know, the sort of back of the envelope math about relief from abuse orders. I've heard that it could be, a couple hundred incidents a year that really have the multiple hour, it's the big move with the final relief from abuse order up to, could be thousands. I don't think it's thousands, but we have no way of knowing based on the testimony we've heard. And there isn't one consistent repository of that data from what our witnesses have told us. So I think it's hard for us to, in this bill, totally solve the problem. I think my primary goal would be to say, we're not going to have survivors pay for this period. And then over the next year, I think we should make a commitment to get that data and come back to this issue next year. That's where I'm starting to land, but I want to hear from everybody else. Representative Henry.
Thank you. So that would mean the additional letter E from the network's proposed language, which is the study. But I was looking back at their proposed language D that they proposed that says sheriff's departments providing law enforcement services in the county in which an individual who has a relief from abuse order resides shall have a duty to assist in the retrieval of personal belongings, et cetera. And I think we could put something in there that refers to absent another primary law enforcement agency being responsible in that municipality or that community. It would default then somehow to the sheriff. And instead of saying a sheriff's department shall not seek a fee, I would say any law enforcement agency shall not seek a fee from the individual being assisted.
So I think the first part of what you're suggesting is what I tried to get with Mr. Devlin's help. And after the feedback we heard from the Sheriff's Association on this issue before. So if you look at 3.1D, now it reads, if an individual who has a relief from abuse order requires assistance in the retrieval of personal belongings and the individual requests assistance from a sheriff's department providing law enforcement services for the county, once that individual resides, the sheriff's department shall provide the assistance.
Okay,
that was meant to make it so that if they go to the sheriff and ask the sheriff will provide it, but not to exclude whoever the primary law enforcement agency is in their town. So if you're in Burlington, you're probably going to call the Burlington PD, not the Chittenden County Sheriff's Office. It would be my assumption, right? Or if you're in the city of St. Albans, you're going to call the St. Albans Police Department, not the Franklin County Sheriff.
Maybe, though. I don't know if the individual is making the call themselves, if they would make that specific choice. So that's why I kind of wanted to make it sound like if there's another primary law enforcement, then that's who they should get directed to. If it's a primary law enforcement agency for that community. So like St. Albans PD. But if you're living in Berkshire, it wouldn't be, because there is no Berkshire PD, it would be likely the VSP or the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. But because Berkshire doesn't contract with the Sheriff's Office, it doesn't have to be. You know, the Sheriff's Office is not Berkshire's primary law enforcement agency. So I think that's where the difference might come in the wording, although I think we're getting close in letter D of 3.1. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Representative Brim and Representative Morgan.
If I heard your entire correctly, your example, we're going to call BPD first, and then sure. If BPD is the primary, I think normally they would do it, but staffing being what it is, they're doing now. And I would imagine that we don't put something in that says you have to have a valid reason. You're the primary, blah, 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 something that maintains some kind of expectation that the primary will do something that everybody thinks left it off to the sheriff.
Well, I think that's true.
That could happen.
Yes, it could very well happen.
Stuff.
And in the case of Berkshire, it may be that nobody wants to respond because nobody feels primarily responsible to
That's what
the town of
Berkshire.
Berkshire. Yeah.
Representative Morgan.
Yeah, I just along, obviously the same vein. I think Rep. Hingle might be on this, something in the absence of a primary law enforcement in that community, law enforcement agency in that community, then the sheriff is the default. And I think something to that effect would do the trick, because it should. I mean, in my town of Milton, we have a PD. We've got, almost 20 officers that we should be handling these. We shouldn't be calling the Chittenden County Sheriff and going, hey, get on down here and do our work, because that would be, I would consider a function of our PD. So something to that effect. Yeah, I like that, in the absence of a primary law enforcement entity in that community. So blah, blah, blah. Something like that. Tim could advise us on that, I guess.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a broad agreement that, if I understand Representative Morgan and Representative Pango, that we should make sure that we're not having the sheriff be the kind of like automatic go-to, but that they should be the backstop.
Yeah.
And that no law enforcement agency should be charging survivors, that we should put a prohibition that's broader than just the sheriff's department. And that we should add something like the new paragraph E that Ms. Scott gave us. Tim, do you need further clarity on what we're looking for, if that's the consensus from the committee? Representative Pango.
Thank you. I have one other question too that probably can't be addressed right here, but what happens to those unbillable hours? Like how is that going to be covered if we are going to rely on a specific law enforcement agency who was in the past charging fees? I mean, I'm concerned for their bottom line as well.
Especially the long ones.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that it's going to be hard for us to solve that in the context of this bill without that report back. But this is really something that we should put on our agenda for when we get back in January, when we have some data, and say, how much is it really costing the state to provide the services when survivors flee, and figure out a funding mechanism for it. If I knew what the number is, I'd march across the hall right now and say, hey, can we figure out how to find this?
And do we need to specify that in section 10 with the report or not?
This is a broader issue, I think, than just sheriffs. And I think the report back in section 10 is really talking about sheriffs. So I think that the clarity that we're asking for with the sheriff and the network to come back to us with a sense of how big is this issue? How many RFAs are there that require standby service? How many is it a quick, it's just an hour, it's no big deal, versus, the multi-hour stops and all that stuff.
One
ahead.
last suggestion then on the network's letter E, where it's asking that the Sheriff's Association work with the Vermont Network to gather data. I think that it should include more than just the Vermont Sheriff's Association. It should include other law enforcement agencies, because we have no way of tracking, right, what other law enforcement agencies or which calls they're going on for this particular specific reason. I mean, if we need to know how much it's costing overall, do we need to know for even the law enforcement agencies who don't charge for that service? I mean, I kind of think we do. Because what if they decide not to be in that business anymore and put it off on the sheriffs? Then we would have a big picture of what it's costing statewide. I mean, I think it would just involve maybe one other group meeting with them, give their input.
Wouldn't it be local police departments, sheriff's departments, state police?
Yeah, so that's 3 groups total.
And the sheriffs?
Maybe, or the bottom 2 could switch.
I mean, not putting in that order, but I'm saying if you're really going to do a comprehensive study, then you,
All 3.
Yeah,
then who's going to gather all of that information for the report, which is time and money that they clearly have an abundance of.
And I'm also wondering if we should include this new position that we're creating, the executive director. Oh, wait, no. director of sheriff's operations.
Yes.
That's
Yeah, we got a new title here. Good job, Representative Wooden.
Is there not somebody within public safety who could take the data from this report? I mean, right now it looks like it would just be the sheriffs sitting down with the network.
So I think what we will find with the network and the sheriffs is that since the sheriffs are the ones that are filling the gaps that aren't covered,
Yeah.
is how many total RFAs are there and a sense of the proportionality. We might not hear, I think it will be, as I'm thinking this through, it would be really cumbersome to ask the network and the sheriffs to consult with every single law enforcement agency in the state.
Right.
But the sheriffs are the ones filling the gaps all across the state. So we're going to get a really good snapshot of a good chunk of the standby services that need to be provided and how many hours does it take? What is really the cost of that? And since they're the ones filling the gap, that's the one that really would need to be filled. I think we would need to take a lot more testimony and do a much more thorough examination of this in order to make this a universal, every single law enforcement agency get a sense of every single RFA and standby services. And I don't know if that's a practical thing to ask for in the context of this bill, but I'm happy to have other folks disagree with me.
I understand that totally. So I think that's great. And I think maybe my suggestion would be, because I'm really curious now, and I bet the network is really curious, my suggestion would be for the network to maybe try to find out that information. How many folks actually statewide from all agencies ask for help in doing this? And that's where I was coming from. Like, if I were working at the network, I'd want to know how many people out there who are encountering this. So for the purposes of this bill, no. Stick with what's suggested.
I have a feeling if we ask for this in statute that and given this conversation and the desire that the network has to make sure that survivors aren't A, on the hook, and B, that I have a feeling that Karen and her colleagues will make sure that we know what we need to know in order to
I think so.
do this better this year.
Thank you. Thanks for entertaining me thinking aloud.
I love it. I think this is it's a really important issue. I mean, we all share a value here, but it's like, who pays for it and how do we even know what the real need is? All right. So Mr. Devlin, do you feel like you have clarity from us on what our ask is for this section?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, would you like to take the chair? I think we have enough time here before we need to dive back in. I haven't seen anything back from Tucker on our other bill that's in progress this morning. So maybe the best use of our time right now would be to take a look at 3.1, the other changes that are in there. And then when we come back from the floor, we'll look at an update that includes this new section 6 language, if that makes sense.
And one other comment before moving on from this topic, I'd just like to bring the committee's attention that the terminology regarding what is a primary law enforcement agency or a law enforcement agency with primary law enforcement coverage is not defined yet, so we'll have to just insert and determine exactly what that means. Probably something along the lines of a law enforcement agency responsible for providing law enforcement services in a certain town, city, or village by statute or contract or something along those lines. But you can propose something to figure that out later. Just want to point that out right now.
Okay, great. We will defer to your expertise and take a look at the recommended way to define that when we come back to it this afternoon. Representative Hango.
Thank you. There's just one real glaring thing on 3.1 that I want to get into before we see Tucker for the next bill. Section 5C starts at the very bottom of page 10, but then goes into 11. Letter B, the Director of Sheriff's Operations shall be funded by a charge assessed on each sheriff's department. I thought we talked about that yesterday with witness Annie Noonan, that there is a position open in state government already that could be used rather than funding this new position through the sheriff's departments.
I thought that that language was coming out and I'm not seeing it in the same place, so am I?
The
Here?
language being referred to is
Ah.
section 5C. And it's the session law that's two parts, one establishing the position and one regarding the funding of it. Chair McCarthy, if you'd like, I could kind of talk a little bit about that information we've received from JFO.
Yeah, because I thought we were going to take that 5CB out. So anyway, yeah.
But I can start by saying we can certainly remove it if that's what the committee would like. When it comes to retitling positions, there is an established sanctioned process called classification review, in which essentially it's a process of looking at the job duties and responsibilities, ensuring that job is kept a comparable pay grade, and that can certainly result in a retitling of a job, especially if it's vacant currently. So that doesn't necessarily have to be addressed through session law here. So I think our office is comfortable removing if that's the direction we.
So would that mean we take out 5C altogether?
I think so.
And so the references to this new director position that are in the other sections just imply that that position exists. And since there's already an exempt position there, we can just sort of close our eyes and say, we don't need to create this. It already exists. We're just.
We've looked at it briefly.
Okay.
I can certainly verify that with our office's attorneys to make sure there's consensus on that.
So here's what I would say. Unless the committee has another opinion on this, is that for now, let's say we're definitely striking 5CB.
Okay.
But that 5CA, we want to get a definitive answer from JFO about whether we need to refer to the existing exempt position in some way, or whether it's sufficient for us to just be referring to this director of sheriff's operations. And then DSAS sort of has to by default fill that position with somebody who would have those duties. So I think that's the open question on that, unless I'm seeing nods.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Progress.
And for the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. Before you, you have draft 3.1 of this committee's strike all amendment to S17. The differences between the last iteration of the strike all amendment and the one you have before you now have been highlighted for ease of reference. The first series of changes can be found on page 2. This is under the section of the bill pertaining to audits, in particular section 2, which will modify Title 24 VSA, section 290 Sheriff's County Sheriff's Department. And again, this is one of 2 sections pertaining to audits. Here we have, let's see, the new language. First few highlights provide clarity that there's actually 2 assistant judges in each county, not just reference to 1. And then of substance, you'll see on line 14 through 19, language that will create a procedure for when an assistant judge potentially refuses to co-sign a disbursement or transfer of departmental assets, and will allow the sheriff's executive committee to instead approve such disbursement or transfer if wanted, and then to notify both the sheriff and that assistant judge of that decision if this so chooses to do so.
Just wanted to check in with Representative Hooper because I believe of Remington, you had a particular interest in this question of yesterday of what happens if a assistant judge just refuses to sign off on any legitimate disbursement that a sheriff that's in the transition period is trying to make. At the recommendation of the association, they said, well, the sheriff's executive committee could kind of act as an appeal authority. When we put that suggested language in front of Tim, it the word appeal and that kind of like getting into that legalistic language is a little tough. So the suggestion, I think, Tim, here is that you would just say if the sheriff's executive committee signs off, they can kind of overrule the assistant judge and be the secondary approver of last resort. I've seen a nod from Sheriff Anderson. But Representative Hooper, I just wanted to make sure that this kind of.
As long as there's an avenue.
Yeah.
I'm happy to read through that new language if you'd like.
Yeah, you want to just hit that piece so we're all.
And the last new sentence reads, if the assistant judges refuse to co-sign a disbursement or transfer of sheriff's department assets, the sheriff's executive committee may instead approve the disbursements or transfer of sheriff's department's assets. It shall thereafter inform the sheriff and the assistant judges of the county of the committee's decision. The next part of the strike all amendment that is updated in this draft can be found at page 4. This is under the section of the bill pertaining to conflicts of interest. And in essence, the changes here are really reflections of certain comments.
Just hold on a second, Tim. Representative Hooper, is your question on the conflict of interest or the back? Okay, yeah, so let's go back first.
In putting that language in, we're not instilling in the assistant judges any authority to actually block and say, I'm just not going to allow that to happen, putting a judge hat on.
No.
Okay.
As laid out here, essentially, and I can just, I'll quote directly from the to be amended language of this statutory section. Online, let's see, starting from 3, there's certain events that will trigger this phenomenon, which all financial disbursements or transfers of assets, basically once the sheriff signals that they're no longer going to stay in office, at that point, any transfer of assets needs to be, it says right here, co-signed by the sheriff and at least one assistant judge in that county. And then if that assistant judge, in the language skipping down to line 5, refuses to co-sign that transfer of assets, then the sheriff's executive committee may instead approve of that transfer.
Because we have rogue side judges too, so.
It's really a backstop, right? It's
Yeah.
like it's a last resort. And I can imagine, like in my county, if the side judge just said no and the sheriff was like, okay, what am I going to do now? Then the sheriff would want to go to some other body and say, I need to do payroll. They won't let me spend this money legitimately. It could get pretty public. I mean, if there's a disagreement. So we would hope that this would be a last resort kind of a thing.
You remember Chittenden County a couple decades ago, the 2 side judges were fighting with each other
And the previous thing of just one side judge needs to sign off so that there's the sheriff plus some outside of the department oversight during the transition period. Any other questions on that piece? Go on to the conflict of interest changes.
So skipping down to page 4, we have certain updates that really reflect comments from the State Ethics Commission that were given to the committee and discussed yesterday. Really, these changes bring this proposed language here pertaining to sheriffs in particular more in line with the state code of ethics. So we have a rephrasing of the first sentence, the same statutory reference really. And the sheriffs and deputy sheriffs are considered public servants for the purposes of what is the definition as laid out in the state ethics code. We also have some tweaking of relations as to what could be considered a conflict of interest, including members of family or households. Then also a additional part of the definition signaling what is not a conflict of interest. In particular, anything that is not greater than that of any other individuals generally affected by the outcome of the matter. The next part, and actually,
Cooper has a question.
sure.
This got into sort of a question yesterday, and I don't know if it's in this particular point or not, but at one point, we were talking about the financial disclosure form for deputies. That's not a common thing for employees to have to file.
I can speak to what is going to be in this update is disclosure, annual financial disclosures, but only for sheriffs, not deputies in this bill. And we'll see that later on. That's the more lengthy bit of highlighted material later on.
Thank you.
I would just like to make a comment on, on subsection C on page 5 here, which has to do with the reporting, or procedures for forwarding ethics complaints, that is, to the State Ethics Commission. In yesterday's discussion of 3 VSA section 1223, which states that the Ethics Commission shall accept complaints from any source regarding governmental ethics in any of the 3 branches of state government or in the state's campaign finance law. There was, it was signaled that perhaps this wouldn't cover sheriff's departments, but our office's interpretation of this language is that sheriff's department are indeed part of the executive branch, one of the 3 branches of governments here, so it would probably covered. But if wanted, this language could be changed to provide clarity, but that's certainly at the committee's discretion. The next section of updated language we have is in subsection D, and this adds a definition for confidential information, which mirrors that in the state ethics code currently, which states, as used in the subsection, means information that is exempt from public inspection and copying under Public Records Act, and otherwise designated, or is otherwise designated by law as confidential elsewhere.
Yeah, and that last piece just clarified what we meant by confidential information, right?
Yes.
So Jim, just to be really clear to Representative Bruce's question, so up until this point, we're saying all sheriffs and deputies fall under the definition of public servants, which means the state code of ethics umbrella covers them. But then in 4A that we're about to go into, we're only talking about the elected sheriff.
Yes. Indeed, new section 4A will add a new statutory section, which will be 24 VSA 315, titled Sheriffs, annual disclosure. And this, in essence, will add new annual disclosure requirements for just the sheriffs again. And this is modeled off of the disclosure requirements for executive officers found currently in the State Code of Ethics under 3 VSA, section 1211. And I'm happy to read through this line by line if the chair would like.
Yeah, I think we can go through this now. The only thing that's giving me hesitation was that I had great hope that we would be able to breeze through a draft of the Lyndonville Charter and get it on its way to the Ways and Means Committee. But Tucker's in the Senate, I think. So we can keep plowing ahead here. This language, before you get into it, is largely taken from what executive officials have to do.
It's essentially a carbon copy, just replacing the terms.
Great.
So that reads, starting on line 19, subsection A, annually, each sheriff shall file with the State Ethics Commission a disclosure form that contains the following information in regard to the previous 12 months. 1, each source, but not amount, of personal income of the sheriff and of the sheriff's spouse or domestic partner, and of the sheriff together with the sheriff's spouse or domestic partner, that totals more than $5,000, including any of the sources meeting that total described as follows. A, employment, including the employer or business name and address, and if self-employed, a description of the nature of the self-employment without needing to disclose any individual clients. And B, investments, described generally as investment income. 2, any board, commission, or other entity that is regulated by law or that receives funding from the state on which the sheriff served in the sheriff's position on that entity. 3, any company of which the sheriff or sheriff's spouse or domestic partner, or the sheriff together with the sheriff's spouse or domestic partner owned more than 10%. Or any lease or contract with the state held or entered into by A, the sheriff or the sheriff's spouse or domestic partner, or B, a company of which the sheriff or the sheriff's spouse or domestic partner, or the sheriff together with the sheriff's spouse or domestic partner, owned more than 10%. Subsection B. In addition, if a sheriff's spouse or domestic partner is a lobbyist, the sheriff shall disclose that fact and provide the name of that sheriff's spouse or domestic partner and, if applicable, the name of that individual's lobbying firm. Section C, subdivision 1, disclosure forms shall contain a statement. Quote, I certify that the information provided on all pages of this disclosure form is true to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief, end quote. 2, each sheriff shall sign the disclosure form in order to certify it in accordance with the subsection. Subsection D, subdivision 1, sheriff shall file the disclosure on or before January 15th of each year, or if the sheriff is appointed after January 15th, within 10 days after the appointment. 2, the sheriff will file this disclosure form as a candidate in accordance with 17 VSA, section 2414, in the preceding year, and whose disclosure information is not changed since that filing, may update that filing to indicate that there has been no change. I'll pause there.
I think that seems like pretty familiar language to me. Haven't been through that disclosure language before, but anybody have any questions about this piece? So this was after hearing Executive Director Sivert's testimony yesterday, just the idea that there'd be a standard financial disclosure for the elected sheriff. Okay. All right.
Moving on to the next part of the bill, which is Sheriff's Department compensation and benefits. See updated language for section 5A on page 9. And this section is titled Sheriff's Department Compensation and Benefits Model Policy. And you'll see in the highlights in subsection A, reworking of the language concerning the development of the compensation model policy. I figure it's just easiest to read this straight through. A, on or before January 1st, 2024, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, after receiving input from the sheriffs, the Auditor of Accounts, and the Department of Human Resources, shall develop a Sheriff's Department's compensation and benefits model policy and submit it for review and approval to the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. The Vermont Criminal Justice Council may, in consultation with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, subsequently alter and update the model policy. And let's see. Then a new subsection C on the next page is added regarding the adoption of that model policy by sheriff's departments. Reads, on or before July 1st, 2024, each sheriff's department shall adopt the sheriff's department's compensation benefits model policy. The sheriff's department may include additional provisions to the model policy in its own policy, provide that none of these provisions contradict any provisions of the model policy. I'll pause there.
Representative.
So if I can, going back up to A, it sounds like the Vermont Criminal Justice Council may, they're going to be kind of the ultimate voice of what that policy.
Yeah, as they do with other model policies. I'm trying to balance two things. One is we have this structure where the Criminal Justice Council is kind of the main, as we did with the domestic violence policy, they're kind of the main issuer of the model policies. But really, the creation and the determination of what should be in that model policy is in large part going to happen between the department and the sheriffs. And the auditor has, DHR all going to be a part of that. So it's it's this thing of making sure that the model policy gets created by the people who know about the inner workings of the sheriff's office and how different they all are. But then there's this approval that it makes sense and conforms with best practices really with the Criminal Justice Council. And then at the same time, the subsequent language, in our testimony and in the feedback that we received from Sheriff Anderson and others, each individual department adopts its own policies. They have to be, when there's a model policy that's been adopted, they have to align and not contradict, but they have specific references and can be more stringent sometimes. And so, when I was on city council, the St. Albans Police Department, they went through a multi-year process of every single policy, use of force, all of that stuff, of updating it, making sure that our policies match the model policies, and then getting approval from the city council on the specific ones that they were adopting. So we're just trying not to get in the way of the normal structure while we're requiring there to be this benefits and compensation policy.
Okay.
I think maybe we've gotten there, and I'll definitely ask Sheriff Anderson and others for confirmation that we finally have hit the mark here. It looks like I'm getting the thumbs up over there, but this has been a long, long process because I think in the initial drafts we were in some weird place of sort of saying, well, the Criminal Justice Council is doing this over here, and yeah, it was a little convoluted. So appreciate everybody, that all those stakeholders, the department, Sheriff's Association, and others kind of setting us straight here.
Thank you.
The next updates can be found in section 5B. Again, this will amend Title 24 VSA section 367, titled Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, adding a new section E, creating statutory reference and building out the duties of the now called Director of Sheriff's Operations, which was what was called Deputy Director of Sheriffs in the previous iteration of this. So E1 just changes that name. E2 does as well. Also, we'll rephrase the duties more robustly and explicitly in sections 2 and 3. And I'll just read through those for now. 2, the Director of Sheriff's Operations shall provide centralized support services for the sheriffs with respect to budgetary planning, new language, policy development, compliance, training, and office management, and perform such other duties as directed by the Executive Director. 3, the Director of Sheriff's Operations shall develop, maintain, and provide to each Sheriff's Department model policies on operational topics, including service of civil process, relief from abuse orders, transportation of prisoners, ethics, and sheriff's responsibilities. And here I'd just like to state that including is open, doesn't exclude anything that's not on this list. So really to be more including but not excluding. And then in section 5C, we've already discussed that. That's the reference I've noted here to strike 5C subsection B and confirm with JFO about whether A needs to be referred to in section 1 or not.
Representative.
Sorry. Just jumped out at me, page 11, line 3, which needs to be capitalized. And I see this is unedited, right? So somebody would have caught that.
Yeah, we'll try and have the S capitalized on the new Director of Sheriff's Operations.
And let's see. The next updates can be found on page 13, section 7. The section 7 that was in the previous iteration here has actually been removed in this draft. The prior section 7 would have required sheriffs to provide deputies to courthouses. It's been removed. 7A, it's been moved up to 7. And this, which is now titled Sheriff's Department Provision of Courthouse Security, report. And this report language is essentially the same, except for it adds some other entities into who the judiciary shall consult in developing this report. Specifically, now, the judiciary shall consult with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, the Vermont Sheriffs Association, Vermont State Employees Association, and then and then other relevant stakeholders. And that is and I should note in section 11, effective dates, there was a reference to the old section 7 being implemented at a later date, but because that's been removed, I've removed that reference.
Yeah, so I think the section 7 piece it's very important to highlight for the committee what's not there. So we had a 7 and a 7A. The 7 was we're going to provide one deputy for every courthouse, but we're not going to have that go into effect until a year from this July. So the July 1st of 2024. Now we're just asking for the report. And I think we will very much have to come back to this once we get the report back and say, how are we going to actually help the judiciary and the various law enforcement and private security transition to some better, new, hopefully more efficient model, which there's a strong implication here that we would have that report. The report is going to consider using something like the transport deputy model for the courthouse security. And so, yeah, there's the implication there that that would be a path for us to potentially get to where we want. Any questions about what's in this draft before we break? We lost Tucker to the Senate, so my hopes have been dashed. So my plan would be that this afternoon, we're not going to do our S9 walkthrough. We're going to come back with Tucker, hopefully probably do that first, go through the Lyndon-Lindenville charter. And then that'll give Mr. Devlin enough time here to get us some of the changes we just asked for to update this draft. And so we'll do those two things this afternoon if that pleases the committee. Great. Well, let's adjourn.